Welcome to the virtual stage. As I said, a fantastic screenwriter, experienced showrunner, a good friend, and my old boss, Peter Ocko. Peter!
Hello!
Peter, thank you so much for being here. Peter has been on a ton of shows, and I was going to read them all out because I thought that would be fun. But then I thought
some time.
An actual more fun bit was to create a ticker banner along the bottom that's just going to scroll your credits. So there we go. It's just going to go on for a while. Peter's most recent show was Moonhaven. I worked with him on Lodge 49. And as you can see, he's been on a bunch of amazing shows. I mean, you see The Leftovers, The Office, Pushing Daisies, 3 Pounds, which he created, Moonhaven, which he created, Boston Legal, Dead Like Me. He keeps going back all the way to Weird Science, Dinosaurs, and Parker Lewis, Can't Lose. Actually, it keeps going after that. When you started, like you work in both worlds, in comedy and drama, which these days seems kind of common, or at least more common, but I don't think that was always the case, right?
No, I mean, and it's weird for me, I have to tell you, and I feel very lucky to, to be in the situation of looking back over, 35 years of doing this. I started when I was pretty young, and the amount of change that has occurred in this business in general, and I would say it's such an exponential curve. The amount of change that happened in the last 5 years was equal to the 10 years before that, was equal to the 20 years before that. So it's like, I think, that little detail alone, when I started, you were drama or you were a comedy. And I remember I spent 10 years in comedy with a writing partner, my best friend. We're still best friends, but, we came out, wrote together as a team, and then realized that we were splitting a paycheck after 10 years that we didn't need to split. So he ended up staying in comedy and I went into drama, but obviously coming out of comedy, my natural instincts were to, inject comedy into whatever I was working on. And that timed out well because I sort of arrived in drama around 2004. And, at the time it was just kind of beginning that wave of dramas in which characters could be funny. It's a wild ride, but I'd rather be, I think, in this business during that kind of radical change than in the business I started in, which felt so predictable that you'd never get bored of it. But I think what we're in now is far more exciting.
What is your definition of a showrunner? What is the scope of that position?
To make it sound as romantic and artful as possible, I would say it's like the conductor, in a sense that you're starting with your script, you're creating something that, again, fits the market, fits what's doable, that it has both like the art that you're in love with, the story, the characters, but it's also producible in a way that you understand, like, I think I know how I would make this given the resources. So you start there, and then, the next thing that comes around, obviously, is you move into a writer's room. And now you're assembling that, and you're hiring writers. There's instances where you have a lot of freedom. And, again, there's other instances where a studio will say, like, well, here's our list of approved people, and you can fight back. And again, like my ability to showrun has changed from when I started to having done a few shows. Now I'm, again, especially staying with the same network, they trust me more. So I have more freedom to say, like, I don't really love your list. I'm going to hire these people. Why don't you take a look at them? But it's all in negotiation. Like, the idea that a showrunner just sort of waltzes in and does what they want. If you're John Wells, for those of you who are old enough or have heard his name, like the old big, 700-pound gorillas, yes. But a lot of the shows that came out in the last 5 years, like the sort of Netflix explosion, there was a lot of people who were made showrunners who hadn't had a lot of experience on set, whose major qualification was they wrote a great script and had a head on their shoulders, like could convince whoever the studio was that they would be able to do this job. But then they had to learn very quickly by talking to other showrunners and taking, the Writers Guild has all these kind of, classes on how to showrun. But it was less, in those instances, I think a lot of those showrunners were given a lot less latitude. Mm-hmm. And studios, again, you can be assigned to a studio where the production manager or the producer on set, the line producer, is truly calling the shots and hiring all the key people, and you may be approving it, or being able to throw a red flag if you really don't want someone. But a lot of times, if you're new to it, you can kind of get carried along by the river. which is dangerous because you'll tell yourself, and this was me in my first pilot, like you'll tell yourself, well, they must know what they're doing. Like, I'll just trust them. And then as things start to happen, you realize there's moments when I look back at my first pilot that I was a showrunner on, and I realized there was a couple moments where I should have just walked out of the room and said, like, this is a terrible mistake and I don't want to do it anymore. But of course, I was young, I had an incredible opportunity, and I was like, I'll just make it work.
I think it's really interesting, the idea that you get this job by being a writer and by being a successful writer, but it is in some ways a management job, right? I've heard it described as you're the CEO of like a small corporation. You are dealing with scheduling and budgets and managing people and hiring. And, how was that transition for you? Were there skills that you took from being a writer that helped you as a showrunner? It almost seems like completely two different jobs.
It is a completely different job. It's completely different. And I think for some people, that's really exciting because you kind of have left brain, right brain, and you kind of create a show on one side of your head and then you problem solve on the other. But a lot of it is like a mind for scheduling, like understanding sort of how things will lay out within the time you have. That's a big part of my job, and it starts day one. So once the staff is assembled, again, the timing, I'll look at the calendar, however many episodes we have, and I know I want to finish the writing before we get to production if I can. So it's kind of a question of like, you take a few weeks to maybe a couple weeks to talk big picture, to kind of talk about the show in the most general terms and not cut off any possibilities that you as the person who wrote the pilot, you might have conceived of the show in a very specific way, but you've just brought in this incredibly talented group of people, and you have to open your mind up and say, like, what do you guys see in this show? And you really do have only maybe a couple weeks to think in that big picture. How are you going to adjust it? What things hadn't you thought of that are now going to play big roles in the season? And then after that, you really do jump into episodes and you're on a clock. And as a showrunner, like your most important job is to get the most out of this team of very creative people, but not lose sight of what needs to be done and when. And it, it doesn't change so much. That part of the job continues right into production. And as a showrunner, it's my job to sit with those directors, even if I didn't create the show. So on Lodge, I would sit with each director of the next block, and we'd go through the show scene by scene and talk about, in that case, how it was going to be shot. What the point of each scene is. Sometimes that gets lost.
So let's go back to those scripts. I think we're called staffing samples, right? That these are the scripts that you are getting. Are those scripts original pilots that each of those writers has written? Are they what's called spec scripts, where they're, existing episodes of existing shows that they've written? What kind of scripts are you reading as sample?
Your calling card as a writer, as it exists today, in terms of like submitting for a show, let's say a scripted hour or a half hour. If you're submitting for a scripted hour, you, in general, these days, would have a sample pilot that you have created from scratch. It's a show that you have thought of the idea, you've created the characters, you've found a template maybe in another show that's similar, that's on television, you've studied that script, you've looked at that structure, you kind of understand how many scenes are going to fit in a 55-page pilot script. And then you've written it and you've shown it to friends and they've given you notes. And then you've maybe, if you know anybody who's actually working in the business, you've shown it to them. Your best bet is to create a pilot that, yes, it would be great if it got shot and it got made. And that is certainly your long-term goal. But if you're just starting out, again, the odds of creating something like that are pretty big. So you also have to think of it as a sample of your ability to solve story problems, to create characters that are interesting, to create moments in a script that are surprising. And that's when someone reads it, the two big check boxes are, one, it looks and feels like an episode of television. It has to be formatted correctly. It has to be proofread to death. The other box it has to check is you have to show off your creativity, if you can put your voice, if you're telling a story that's your own. If, again, for me, I look for moments that surprise, where a character will do something, or where you're able to kind of dramatize a moment with action that without dialogue, that's kind of, oh, I didn't see that coming, or it has some sort of cinematic poetry to it. Like, you do want to showcase that kind of work. I read sample scripts. Again, like, the stack will come from the studio. I'll get other submissions from agents. Friends will say, you got to read this person. You know, this woman's a great writer. Please take a look at her. It's way too much material in the initial onslaught to like sit down and read through 1,000 scripts. So what I do, and what I think a lot of showrunners will do, is you give a script like 10, 20 pages. And if you're not sort of captivated and surprised in some way, or you see some sort of direct link to the show you're running, you move on. Don't wait till page 20 to like kick into something great. You really do need to kind of use your first 10, 15 pages and put your best foot forward, because again, there's such a volume of people who are competing for these jobs. The process can be arbitrary and maddeningly so. If I get into a good script, I'll tear through the whole thing. You don't really have more than that to capture someone's attention, I'd say, for the most part.
When reading specs to staff up on shows, do you have regular agents you accept scripts from, or do you work with different agents for every show? How does that work? I think that in a broader sense, how do the scripts get to you? What if you don't have an agent? You know, what if you don't have reps?
Yeah, no, and what if your agent isn't like CAA and in with the studio? And there's no question that I will get the favored stack of scripts, and that can be like a studio exec whose best buddy is working at CAA, and there's all this kind of politics I'm not even aware of. There's definitely, I'd say it's better than it used to be, but it's still really problematic. And I certainly won't not read something from an agent I don't know. If an agent cold calls me and says, I really want you to just take a look, I'll always take a look. So if you have an agent and, you know, they're not the top dog at whatever, some agency, if they're aggressive, sometimes that really does make a difference. And then again, the other way is, you know, somebody who knows somebody. If I get an email from somebody I worked with 3 shows ago and they're like, hey, I got this, you know, would you just take a look at this script? I think you should, you know, it might work for your show. I'll absolutely read that. You know what I mean? So there's other ways to get through the gauntlet. But it is still very much like a gatekeeping gauntlet. It's hard, just the scale of the number of scripts that are, you know, for the number of jobs.
Helene Taylor, I'll be in my first room next week. Congratulations. That's awesome.
Yeah, that's great.
What are the top 3 things you appreciate most from your writers?
Oh, that's a great question. This is going to sound... the ability to listen more than you speak when you start. When I started on my very first staff, which was like a show called Parker Lewis Can't Lose, it was a sitcom, a single camera sitcom. The first day I got there with my writing partner, the showrunner came to us and said, you guys aren't going to do anything for 2 months. I just want you to sit there and listen. He wasn't telling us not to speak, but he was just basically emphasizing the fact that, like, no one expects you to show up being an expert. And it's really an important skill to be able to listen and kind of pick up on the vibe of the room and pick up on the culture of the room. That's really important. What else is important? I think having a pitch that's thought out, especially when you're starting. If you're going to pitch a story, do yourself the favor of giving yourself a little bit of time to be able to pitch it in a way that has like a beginning, middle, and an end. Even if it's a beat or a scene, give yourself a little bit so that when you're trying to convey it, because part of being in a room is not just having good ideas, it's being able to convey them in a way that people understand why they're good. So give yourself a little time, take a breath, think it through, and then pitch it. The other thing I'd say is come every morning with some ideas prepared. I tend to assign homework, you know what I mean? Like, I'll say at the end of a day, like, this is what I really want everybody to think of. Can people come up with some pitches on this particular thing? Some rooms will do that, which actually makes your job easier. But I've been in rooms where either I've been showrunning or I've just been a staffer and homework has been assigned. And I see people who've been working in this business for a long time kind of show up and scribble something on a Post-it just as the room begins. And I find that like crazy, because if you've got time to go home, you know, sit in the bath, think about something, come up with 1 or 2 clear, good thoughts on, you know, that would help move the room forward. It's great to show up with those in the morning and just have them.
What are the chances of living overseas working as a showrunner writer? As a showrunner, it's going to be hard, but I've certainly found or heard about more writers. You know, I knew a couple writers in Mexico City who were working in rooms because it was all on Zoom. So I think there certainly is more opportunities because of Zoom for writers, particularly, I would say, if you live in a country that the show you're writing on takes place in, and you can bring that like expertise as a citizen of that country to the show, and the language knowledge and all of them, the cultural knowledge, can be helpful.
Also, like on the last few staffs I've had a few people who live in New York, you know, and they would just Zoom in because they didn't want to have to move to Los Angeles. It was their first job, and I was willing to, you know, to do it. And, you know, that it worked fairly well. The one thing about being overseas is the time difference makes your life absolutely miserable, because we did production overseas, and we'd have creative meetings with LA. So, you know, I'd come back to my apartment at like 10 or 11, and we'd just be hopping on a phone because that's when the executives were sort of ready to meet. And so that, you know, as you get farther away, it does become more of an obstacle. But yeah, I mean, if you're a staff writer and you don't live in Los Angeles and you're not ready to commit to move here, but you have a great sample, there's plenty of showrunners who might say, yeah, we'll take you on and you'll Zoom in.
What is the story? Maybe we'll just end with, how do you actually break a story in the room? What is that process like? How do you come up with the stories with your group of writers?
I think you really are just trying to solve the problem of how do you surprise people with the dramatic action of the show, right? And trying to avoid things where you know the audience is going to get ahead of you, or where the audience, you know, where you just know like, the audience is going to see that coming. I mean, the biggest problem and wonderful thing about today's audience is there's so much content, right? And I hate that word. There's so much television out there that everybody's seen everything. You know, people who just lived their lives and watched their shows have already seen way more TV than I ever saw growing up. Like, they're just exposed to stories more. So the job of breaking a story, I think, is harder these days, because you really have to kind of outthink an audience that has seen everything. So, you know, again, the day-to-day, like sitting in a room, you might take, I'd say we'd take a week to 2 weeks to break a single episode. And that might have within it, you know, an A story and then a side story, and you'd kind of interweave those by the end of the second week. But, you know, every day you're just kind of hammering forward and trying to kind of, you know, what's the next problem to solve?
Peter, I want to thank you so much for joining us. Wonderful guest, and shared some amazing knowledge.
Yeah, well, listen, I just wish everyone the best of luck. It really is a wonderful business to be able to sort of mesh business and art. And I just wish you the best of luck.